Hello, my name is Aaron Hertzmann, and I'm going to talk about visual indeterminacy in GAN art. GANs, or Generative Adversarial Networks, have become quite popular among artists who work with machine learning. For example, this installation piece by Mario Klingelmann was recently auctioned at Sotheby's. Some artists who have longer histories, like Trevor Paglen and Jason Salavon, have been experimenting with them. And here's some other examples from Helena Sarin and Sofia Crespo. So why is it that GAN images and GANs as tools for visual art have become so popular? The main thesis of my talk is that GAN art images exhibit something called visual indeterminacy, and this is what makes them so appealing and so intriguing as tools for visual art. Visual indeterminacy is a term coined by Robert Pepperell to describe images that seem at first as if they should make sense as images, but as you study them, they don't lead to coherent interpretations. For example, this impossible trident, at first glance, looks like just a normal object. But as you study closer and try to figure out its precise shape, it doesn't actually add up to something. The art historian Dario Gamboni has surveyed these kinds of images throughout art history in a book called Potential Images. Here's one example from Turner, who produced a lot of images that have this sense of looking like a real scene, and yet so many of the individual details can't quite be interpreted. But ambiguity became particularly important in the modern art era. For example, Picasso said that when looking at a picture, the more associations it can open up, the better. So in the modern art era, ambiguity and suggesting different interpretations and different sorts of meanings became particularly valued in art. And the painter Gerhard Richter simply had said, "I don't like pictures that I can understand." He's also provided kind of an interesting perceptual story as to how this process works. He says, "We only find paintings interesting because we always search for something that looks familiar to us. And usually we find those similarities, table, blanket, and so on. And when we do not find anything, we're frustrated, and that keeps us excited and interested." So in other words, we have this natural built-in drive in our perceptual system to, when we see a new image, to try to understand it and interpret it. And if it seems like we should be able to and we can't, then we keep studying it and keep being interested by it. Here's a painting by Robert Pepperell, which is specifically designed to have this sense of indeterminacy, to feel like a Renaissance painting without leading to any definitive interpretation. And when I first saw this image, I thought GANs. I showed it to some colleagues and asked how they thought it was made, and most of them said neural networks, even though this was a physical painting made 15 years ago. When you start to experiment with GANs, for example, with Joel Simon's Art Breeder tool, you really start to see images that have this indeterminate quality, that they look like real scenes, and yet you can't quite identify or name what's going on in this scene. It's very easy to make indeterminate images using GANs. So for example, here's one Art Breeder image that I like that has the sense of a scene with some kind of round object that has some things sitting in it, maybe eggs or fur or hay or something, but you can't really, or at least I can't really come to any coherent interpretation of what's going on here, even though it seems like a real scene. Here's another example where, to me, this image looks very much like a store, maybe like an optician or eyeglasses store, but I can't really specifically identify a lot of the individual objects. I can't even really tell where different things begin or end. So it doesn't really add up in terms of the details of the shape. So why is it that GANs seem so predisposed to producing these kinds of images? Well, we can't say exactly how they work, but there's been a line of research in computer vision in the past few years that has led to some interesting interpretations of what's going on under the hood. So at a very simplified cartoon view, we can think of the network as taking some random vector as input on the left, the z vector, and there's a sequence of layers that refine the arrangement of elements of the scene and add more and more detail. At the end, the last layer takes that and turns it into pixels, and by adding texture. And so the earlier layers may be specifying bigger ground, and then adding clouds and trees and mountains. And then finally, more and more details are added until we get to the pixels at the end. And so you can imagine that if one of these layers is a little bit off, or we somehow tweak the results, then we start to see slight deviations from real layouts that there'll be some sky in the ground, or the dog might be told it should have 3 eyes. And then later layers will still add as much texture as to make that layout look as real as possible. So essentially, in a way, the GAN is piecing together realistic textures, but sometimes the layouts of those different textures don't quite make sense. And texture here can mean the arrangements of where the trees are, or where are the leaves in the trees, or how many legs the dog has, and so on. So this is a very cartoon, simplified view of what GANs might be doing, and but it gives one possible sense of how it might be working. Now, some GANs are getting so good that they can keep producing images after each other that all look real. Like the style GAN model on faces produces a lot of realistic looking faces. And as a result, it doesn't produce indeterminate images so much that have this indeterminate aesthetic. Of course, they may have other aesthetics. And so what we start to see is that artists break the models. They fiddle with the GAN so it no longer does what it's supposed to in order to get indeterminacy. And so we see with ArtBreeder, the ArtBreeder model is actually using invalid class embedding vectors to produce its output. And on the right, here's an example where Mario Klingemann has manipulated style GAN so it doesn't produce as realistic images as it is designed to do. And as GANs get better and better, artists will be finding more and different ways to control and manipulate the way these models deviate from realism. So to conclude, indeterminacy, I argue, is the dominant aesthetic of GAN art. GANs seem naturally predisposed to generate indeterminacy, and this is what gives them this look of modern art, this sense of multiple interpretations, which is so valued in modern and contemporary art. I think this comes about because of the ways that GANs can go wrong of making weird arrangements in pictorial space. Now, this is just a feeling of art. It may or may not be long-lasting. Maybe GANs are a fad that will be over next year. But I think a lot of these ideas will carry through with whichever comes next. As long as we have machine learning models that are very good at producing realistic scenes, but can still be manipulated to be a little bit off, we'll see different kinds of indeterminacy created by artists. I also think that GANs could be useful for studying aesthetic experience. And towards this end, we have a perceptual psychology paper which uses GANs to quantify indeterminacy and ambiguity in ambiguous image. And this paper should be online very soon. Thank you.